Hi everyone, Matt Barbet here, ready to put your questions on Ukraine to Professor Michael Clarke. Who is Michael? Putting me to shame today, looking way smarter than I am. Do excuse the slightly dressed down look. I hope you won't mind. Doesn't matter when we're not doing the usual stuff, Michael, does it? We'll do that later this afternoon. Yep. There's so much, there's always a lot to talk about with Ukraine, but certainly so much in the last couple of days, particularly with so many world leaders turning up in Davos for the World Economic Forum, not least Volodymyr Zelensky. We'll get onto that in a second. Before we do, let's just talk about today's trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi. We've had talks before. We've had the US talking to Russia, the US talking to Ukraine, Ukraine and Russia talking, but all together in one place. Is that, in your opinion, going to move things forward towards some sort of ceasefire, some sort of end to the war?
I doubt it, because the Ukrainians need to show that they're keen to talk. And so they're sending quite a high-powered delegation. I mean, Umarov is leading it, who's their main negotiator now and is close to Zelensky. And they've got a good delegation. The Russians look as if they're just sending a military delegation. And that actually is going to be a problem. It looks as if the Russians have got nothing to offer other than more of the same. You've got to give in or the war will continue. And so although, I mean, Witkoff is speaking very optimistically about this, saying we're close to peace, we're very close. Well, they're closer than they've ever been before, which is to say not close enough. Because the issues that, unless the Russians are going to give, and I'm sure they won't because of the delegation they're sending, there's no political authority in that delegation. And unless they're going to give something specifically on territory issues, they drop this demand that they have to be given the bit of the Donbass they haven't yet conquered, the fortress cities, which are really important to the Ukrainians, not just politically and spiritually, but also in terms of their future defence. They feel they mustn't give up these fortress cities, or they'll then lose a lot more territory to the west of those cities on the low ground. So unless the Russians are prepared to compromise on that, and there's no indication that they are, then I think they'll play for time. So, I mean, I think what this is all about, what I've always thought this was all about, is the failure of this third version of the peace process that the Americans have initiated. We've been around the same circle 3 times now. This is the 3rd time. And it's a question of who gets the blame for the failure, which is why the Ukrainians and the Europeans are leaning as far as they possibly can towards looking constructive. And the Russians are just saying, well, these are our demands. You're not meeting our demands. We'll talk about it. But I'm sure that they will come back with more requirements. The Russians won't say tomorrow, OK, we've agreed a deal, or even we've agreed an outline deal. I'll be very surprised if they do. What I think they'll say is, well, there are things we'll have to take away and think about, because the Russians don't want to ceasefire. They still think they're winning. In some respects, they're making some gains, but even smaller than they were about a month ago. But they're really hurting the Ukrainians with their air attacks every night. It's very cold in Ukraine. It's the coldest winter for many years now, and they're in their 4th winter. It's really hurting them. And I think the Russians just want to keep on doing that to see where it gets them. So they're not in any mood to have a ceasefire. And I don't think we'll see anything coming out of this meeting.
It was Martin asking whether he thought this would lead to anything, this meeting. So you think they're just kicking it into the long grass, Russia? And it seems to me that someone else just prior to us recording this was saying, what do you make of this? This is different. This is new. Again, that's what Martin is asking as well. But until the Russians show something, then to go back on your point, they're not showing anything.
No, they're not. I mean, the reason that there's more detail being talked about now is that there's a lot of theoretical issues here, a lot of hypotheticals. So if there is a ceasefire, then these might be the security guarantees. If there is a ceasefire, these might be the territorial arrangements. If there is a ceasefire, these might be the development ideas. If there is a ceasefire, these might be the ideas of a referendum and then an election in Ukraine. All these things have been talked through if there is a ceasefire. None of these things will happen unless there is a ceasefire. And the Russians don't want a ceasefire. So that's where we are with it. And we're going through the mechanics again. And the Russians, they know that they've got a great asymmetry here. When President Trump looks at Ukraine, he sees nothing but commitments and possible difficulties. When he looks at Russia, he sees nothing but possible deals and opportunities. And that's the point. And even if Trump secretly knows that he's being lied to by Putin. The rest of us know he's being lied to by Putin. But even if he knows he's being lied to by Putin, he has a strong motive to pretend he believes Putin, because ultimately he wants to get the Ukraine war out of the way in order to do deals with Russia. And that's his overall sense of the strategic future. And Ukraine can never, in a sense, get round that. Ukraine can only carry on with some, they hope, minimum of American help while this war goes into a fifth and probably a sixth year.
I don't know about you, Michael, but Groundhog Day is one of my favourite films, but I certainly would not want to live in it. And that's how Volodymyr Zelensky kicked things off, saying it is like Groundhog Day for them in Ukraine at the moment. And many of...
It's a good metaphor, wasn't it? It
everyone knows
with an audience.
Everyone knows what he's talking about. Everyone knows it's that tedious repetition. Of course, it's a lethal repetition for many in Ukraine. But many people watching and listening were shocked by his speech, though, in Davos. A couple of people have been in touch on this, and it does split opinion somewhat. MWG doesn't have a question, but felt strongly about the speech, saying if it wasn't for the UK and Europe, when Trump ditched Ukraine, Zelensky would have had no one. He needs to show gratitude for support, not disrespect. Jamie takes the opposite view, saying simply very true, well said, President Zelensky. How do you think he pitched it? Because it was certainly a change of tone from him towards his European allies, the coalition of the willing.
Yeah, I think there were a number of things going on there. I mean, partly, I think we should, in a way, take him at his word that I think he feels personally angry and frustrated. I mean, he's been a war leader for 4 years. He's been in power since 2019. You know, he would like to have an election. I mean, if only he wasn't in the war, he would have had an election.
Yeah.
And that him and his people, although, you know, there are all sorts of issues going on inside the Rada, the parliament, and within internal politics in Ukraine, they're quite confident that they would win an election. Whether they're right or not, we don't know. But that he's quite chipper about that. And
he's had some domestic issues, hasn't he?
Terrific ones. Yeah.
Corruption.
Yeah, the corruption issues,
with some of
but he's insulated himself from that largely.
Yeah.
And the view, I mean, I'm getting this from sort of contacts in Kyiv, that they say if we did have an election as a result of some sort of peace process, if there were a sudden breakthrough, we'd probably win. If we had a quick election, which it would be, a 3-month, 4-month process, they said we would win. They feel very confident.
Just as a bit of an aside, do you think he'd want to? Because I'm sure he is so fatigued by all of this. He seems fatigued. And who wouldn't be?
Yeah, I know, you're absolutely right. I think that's the point. Sometimes he seems remarkably chipper. Yeah. And he says things like, look, I'm younger than Putin. I'll still be here when Putin's dead. I mean, you know, Trump will be dead. I'll still be here. He has an optimistic sense of his own future, even though he and his family live under a sort of death sentence from the mafia, in effect.
Yes.
That the Russians will always, whilst Putin and his people are in power, they'll always be chasing him to try to kill him. But he's remarkably optimistic. But, of course, you can also see he's got the 1,000-yard stare.
Yeah.
Sometimes when you look at him, you can see there's fatigue in his face, the 1,000-yard stare. So I don't know if he would want to stay in power, or he would like to win an election to make the point and then hand over to somebody.
Yeah.
But he must want a break. But he is frustrated and personally exasperated that they're not getting the ammunition that they need. He said 2 weeks ago, quite unusually for him to say it in public, we're running out of anti-aircraft ammunition. And the reason that they're suffering so badly just at the moment in this uniquely cold winter with uniquely high regular nightly Russian attacks. We're now on the 113th day, if I've got my calculations right, of nightly Russian attacks. It's like the Blitz in London in 1940-41. I mean, 113 days now of an attack every single day on the energy infrastructure. So as soon as they repair it, it's attacked within a couple of days. So it's wrecked again. And so they're having a uniquely rotten time. And he's so frustrated that they would do much better against these attacks if he wasn't running out of ammunition. Simple as that. So he said that, and he's exasperated. So I think that's the personal side of it. The other side, I think, may be true, and there's some credibility in this, that he wanted to sound like Trump. Not because he admires Trump, really, but that he thought it would play well with Trump if he beat up the European allies. He didn't insult them in the way that Trump enjoys insulting his European allies, but he beat up on them for their failure to deliver on the things that they said. Now, they've delivered on a lot on what they said, but the fact is the Europeans are not ramping up their own defence production as fast as they said they would.
Yeah.
They're still allowing process to get in the way. And they were the Ukrainians and he were genuinely annoyed, really annoyed, back in December. Remember, we talked about it coming up to the end of December.
Yes.
The use of the frozen Russian assets to give them to Ukraine. Well, they funked it. They wouldn't do it in the end. And
so it was Belgium, wasn't it, where the assets
right.
are being
Belgium
held.
said, we won't agree to it. And, politically, that was a foolish thing to do. It made the Europeans look weak, very weak, and divided. Now, what they did instead was create a 90 billion loan on the basis of EU, continuous spending or the EU budget. Well, if it was that easy, they could have done that years ago. So they've given them a sort of second best, which at least keeps Ukraine in the fight, gives them the money to carry on. But the failure of Europe to confront that big issue, make the Russian reserves, the 200 billion euros worth of Russian reserves sitting in Europe and another 100 billion in the United States, make them available, just give them to Ukraine to fight the war. That would have been a huge morale boost, and he didn't get it. So I think there's a lot of annoyance from that as well.
Let's not forget, Europe did lend Ukraine billions of euros to tide them over for the next, I think, 2 years.
That's right, yeah. At least 2 years,
So
90 billion.
They've stepped up in a fairly big way, haven't they?
They have. And Ukraine, the Europeans are providing far more, more than double or almost treble now the amount of aid that the United States has provided.
Yeah.
Total US aid since 2022 still only comes to 120 billion. Only. And despite what President Trump says, and I keep reminding people of that 120 billion, 90% of it was spent in the United States. The money never actually left the US because it was spent on weapons that were produced in the United States. So the Europeans are already stepping up. And the British, I have to say, Kyiv is extremely grateful to the British.
Yeah.
Tony Radakin, who was our CDS until recently, our Chief of Defence Staff, he was a real hero in Kyiv because they said, this man, he's a toughie, he's got good ideas, he helps, bring the other NATO allies along. As the United States has become more unpopular in Ukraine, for reasons that we can all imagine, Britain has become relatively even more popular. So Britain itself I don't think is taken for granted. But the Europeans as a whole and the EU, I think the Ukrainians, they feel, 4 years and we are still the front line for your liberty against this madman in the Kremlin who actually will subjugate a lot of Europe to either his direct control or his influence if you let him.
Certainly, in terms of diplomacy, Britain broadly has had a good week in terms of the situation with Greenland not responding emotionally to Trump. I don't know if you saw the note that Mette Frederiksen, the Danish PM, left with a little help from our friends. She wrote when meeting Keir Starmer at Chequers this week. Anyway, just an observation, not mine, but certainly what a lot of people have been saying this week. Let me mention these questions. You've broadly answered them already, Michael, but it's worth mentioning that Pauline said, I was shocked by Zelensky's Davos speech. Actually, is he right about Europe? And was it a genuine attack on European allies, or was it just a ploy to please Trump? It seems like you're saying it's more of the latter. Actually,
I think so, but there was a bit of personal aggravation in it, but I think it was a calculated tone which he decided to adopt to impress the White House and to say to the Europeans, look, you're spending all your time on Greenland, I understand that, but actually the big issue in Europe is the war we are fighting for you.
Adrian was asking, why did Zelensky criticise European nations during his Davos speech? I think we've just answered that, Adrian. Surely he needs to keep these people on side, considering how volatile Trump is.
And also, Matt, the Europeans are cutting him a lot of slack, I think. I think a lot of European diplomats in the room at Davos, they understood.
Yes.
They weren't upset by it in the way they were really annoyed by the way Trump, had that long, rambling, critical, insulting speech. In Zelensky's case, they kind of nodded and they said, look, we understand.
But let me just draw out from Adrian's question about surely Ukraine needs these Europeans. Let's remember, while we're looking at the geopolitical stage, just the issues these countries have got domestically. It's about money. Of course, there's a big discussion here in the UK about the welfare state and how you spend enough on defence. France is further up that creek without a paddle financially. And we also had Trump as well saying, well, Macron's not going to be around for much longer. Which is kind of true because I think there's a presidential election next year now. There's an issue there that they might want to support Ukraine more. They just haven't got the cash.
Yeah, and all of the big four are in a sort of political turmoil. So Macron is effectively a lame duck and has got turmoil, below him.
Not least his eye issues and wearing his shades all the time.
Shades, And Friedrich Merz, he's very assertive. I think he's a very good news politician for Europe as a whole. But he's got big domestic problems. He comes over much better on the international stage than domestically. Giorgia Meloni, again, she's got to play a very careful role here, and she's not got a great domestic basis for her policy. And of course, Keir Starmer is in some domestic trouble, as is the economy that's still very, very sluggish. And there's a phrase that is, the first sentence of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina It's the most brilliant sentence. He says, happy families are all rather the same, but unhappy families are all unhappy in their own particular way. And that's it. I mean, Europe is a series of unhappy families, and they're all unhappy in their own particular way, and it creates that sense of unhappiness across Europe, which are very dark days to live through. But they're all unhappy for different reasons.
I think quoting Russian literature it ties a nice bow around that one. I'm glad you didn't ask me what the quote was.
Yeah.
Expose my
famous first sentence.
Ignorance. Yes, well, it's a good one. Alicia pivots away from what we're talking about in regards to Zelensky's speech. And here's their question. What did you think Zelensky really thinks about Trump's US seizing Maduro? Alicia asks. He seemed to suggest Europe should act more boldly as America did in Venezuela to ensure Putin faces justice. Could Putin ever be captured, they ask?
Yeah, well, no to the last bit. I mean, Putin's never going to be captured, I think. And in a way...
You might get one of his lookalikes by mistake.
Yes, exactly. He does have two or three of those in general. I mean, because his hair goes longer and shorter very quickly.
Yeah, his weight seems to fluctuate a little bit as well,
right,
yeah.
Exactly. Oh, it's a real parlour game, working out whether it's the real Putin you're looking at when he goes on these trips and so on. So, no, he's not going to be captured, nor is it probably a good thing if he were. It's better if his rule comes to some other end that Russians themselves can understand, and that it's internal to Russia, whatever happens to him. So I don't think that's going to happen. But, I mean, I think in the other part of the question, what did Zelensky think about the Maduro kidnapping? I don't know what he thought about that.
Probably got more things to worry about.
Exactly. I'm sure he regards Venezuela as a problem for him because it distracts attention. All these things, I mean, Gaza distracts attention, Iran, all of these things that are going on in the world distract attention from what he would regard, of course, as the most important existential challenge to liberal democracy. On the other hand, what the Americans have done as part of their Venezuela policy, actually getting tough with the dark fleet, the shadow fleet, these Russian ships, Zelensky must be in favour of that because that makes it harder for Russia. And what's interesting about this whole dark fleet issue is that because of their Venezuela obsession, the United States are now doing something which hurts the Russians. And the Russians keep completely quiet about it. When the United States moves against their ships, and they've now moved against, I think it's 7 or maybe it's an 8th ship, I can't remember now, in the last few hours, most of which have got Russian-related oil on them or some relationship to Russia, or the ship is. And the Kremlin has said nothing by way of criticism. When the British get involved and the French get involved, the Russians are going berserk because they feel as if they can complain about that. And here we are. I mean, there is a general will on the part of the NATO allies now to get tough on the dark fleet, thank goodness, finally. And the French have just lifted this ship called the Grinch.
Yeah, well...
Great name for a ship.
Well, it's obviously a month too late, given it's quite Christmassy. Let me just come in on that because we've got a question on it for you, Michael. J. Mark wants to know what we know about it and also asks, is there a danger Russia will start to defend oil tankers with air and naval power? Could such a confrontation escalate to war? Because we have seen Russian military craft infiltrate or come into our areas, whether it be aerial or via sea. So they do buzz us in a way. But is it in terms of protecting that fleet?
It is. The Boykai is a corvette that's running up the channel at the moment, and the Boykai has been used to. This is a Russian Baltic Fleet corvette. It's not a big ship, but it's a warship, and so it carries the symbolism of a warship. And it's been escorting tankers through the channel, which we have been monitoring and so on. And the question is, when or whether we're going to make a move against one of these things. So the French have done it now a couple of times. They intercepted the Grinch going through the Gibraltar Straits, and they boarded it and have checked it out. And I'm not sure what the status of that is. I think they've still got it under their control while they're looking at it, because even if it doesn't have a contraband cargo, which it probably does, but even if it doesn't, chances are it hasn't got proper insurance documentation, proper ownership registrations and so on.
Just a point on that. What jurisdiction did the French have over this? If it's in international waters, which it sounds like it is in the Straits of Gibraltar, how can a French ship intercept another ship and take it over?
There are two reasons. One is that everyone is entitled on the high seas to the right of innocent passage. The word is innocent. So if you think the passage is not innocent and you can prove it, then you have some right to board a ship. And then the second would be if you are boarding a ship in pursuance of international law, maritime law, or United Nations resolutions, or some other form of legal framework, then you say, well, on the basis of this legal framework, we're boarding the ship. It is a grey area, but it's not the case that every ship can do what it likes on the high seas. It can't.
Yeah.
And that's the basis on which the Americans have been boarding tankers coming off Venezuela. The thing about that we don't talk about too much in Britain, we said that in the case of the Grinch, we assisted in that. Well, we did in terms of intelligence, and we've got some air assets. I mean, we've got our Poseidon P8 maritime surveillance aircraft, which are pretty good. You know, they're the best in the world. We've got, I think it's 8 of them based at Lossiemouth, and they can go elsewhere and they can cover a large area of sea, so they can track on something. But to be honest, Matt, we haven't got any warships that can actually go and do the job. And so we had the tide surge against the ship that the Americans boarded a couple of weeks ago. The tide surge is an RF-8, a Royal Fleet Auxiliary tanker, because that's all we could put to sea. I mean, we haven't got any Type 45 destroyers available. We've got 6 of them, we've got 3 of them at most available for sea. I'm told it might only be 1 at the moment. And our Type 23 frigates, I mean, I think today it is being announced that HMS Richmond has been retired. It was due to be retired sometime this year, but I think that's the announcement. And its replacement, HMS Glasgow, won't be, it's in the water now, but it's been fitted out. That won't be available till sometime next year. There's a gap. We don't have warships to put up against these characters. So in relation to, I'm not just whinging about the Navy, in relation to this question, we have to be very careful, because if we do get tough about these ships, which we said we will, and the Russians do react, which they will if it's Britain and France and the Europeans, not the Americans. If it's non-American, the Russians will react. And yes, we may find ourselves in incidents, naval incidents. Now, they're not going to lead to war, but they certainly don't help. And the question I think that the MOD has got to ask itself is, if we are going to get ourselves into a situation where we enforce the law, we do something about the dark fleet ships using, sailing through our waters, have we got the ships and aircraft available to take on a Russian retaliation if necessary? And the answer at the moment is, I'm not sure we have.
Here's the question, though, and it's one for NATO, isn't it? Surely an attack on us is an attack on all under Article 5, and therefore, and we know NATO seems a lot weaker than it did, although Mark Rutte seems to be having a fairly good week in terms of being the Trump whisperer. If they were to escalate in that way, if you think Russia would at some point, then surely it's invoke Article 5 and the US will have to get involved, wouldn't it?
Well, they may or may not. I mean, Article 5 has become very sort of context-specific now, I think. But that is the case. Yeah, it affects all of our NATO allies, and our European partners are onto it, particularly our Scandinavian partners. So at the moment, the ship that's been going through the channel is the Slobolev. Yeah. And anyone who's old enough to remember Bill and Ben, the Flowerpot Men, finds that very easy to remember. The Slobolev. That's how they used to speak to each other, Slobolov. And so the Slobolev, going through the channel, we've tracked it. Now we've handed it over, I think, to the Danes or the Dutch. I'm not certain about that, but we've handed it over to somebody else. So yeah, between us, we can all track these things. And other navies have got more ready ships. They may not be as good as some of ours, but they've got more of them, and they're at sea, which is the point. And so yes, we can do something about it. But we as Europeans, non-US Europeans, I think, are going to have to take this on in a joint way. And the Brits, we talk a good game, as we always do. I'm not sure we've got the hardware to put up against it.
Well, that really does beg a final couple of questions from me, Michael. The appetite may be there, but maybe this goes back to what Zelensky was saying. A lot of it's talk, a lot of it's hot air. But in terms of actually, to use a colloquial phrase, tooling up quickly, we can't do it. The UK can't do it.
Not quickly enough. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of good things going on, and there's lots of... Our defences will look a lot better after 2027, but the after 2027 is now beginning to look like after 2028. And we, as always, we keep pushing the adequacy back another 18 months, another couple of years, and that's what you can see with the question of, when is HMS Glasgow, our new Type 26, when is it actually going to be available to the Navy? In theory, next year. Maybe it won't be to the end of next year. Maybe it will be delayed as a way of saving money immediately. And that's the problem. We are walking towards some sort of militarized confrontation with Russia, not necessarily a war, but militarized confrontation. And we're still, as it were, gearing up for it without any real sense of urgency. And all of our governments are still, they recognize the issue, they recognize the need, but it's always 2 to 5 years away, never this year and next year.
Because is there a preoccupation then with this sort of proxy war we're involved with at the moment. You've got the shadow fleet. You've got them dragging their anchors and trying to damage infrastructure. We've seen that with cables in the Baltic.
Yeah.
There's a risk of it, of course, cables in the North Sea. Is it the fact that there's the MOD, the government, is struggling to think long-term enough because they're so preoccupied with the short to medium-term problems, of which there are many?
Yes, exactly so. I mean, you've got to understand all governments have an issue with that. They've got lots of issues to worry about. They've got their own
and the electoral cycle.
The electoral cycle, of course. And it's no good having great ideas if you get booted out at the next election because the public are annoyed with you for not fixing education or the health service or whatever. And political analysts understand that absolutely. But there are times in the history of Europe and the history of any individual country when big strategic decisions have to be made, and those decisions have been recognised in the last 2 to 3 years. We recognise the choices, we recognise the dark days that we're heading towards, but that's not the same as recognising it isn't the same as making decisions. And as we always say, hope is not a strategy. You have to strategise on what is in front of you, and those decisions are not being made. And to govern is to choose. So you have to choose, and you have to sacrifice some things in order to privilege others. And that's a difficult thing to do. I wouldn't like to have to do it. But all European governments are facing that issue. To govern is to choose. And we are facing some very dark times ahead. And the best way to get through them is to have a war-fighting deterrent which is sufficient to deter the war we hope not to get involved in.
Look, it's a fascinating chat, Michael. It always is. What is a concerning time? You never know. Something might come out of Abu Dhabi that shifts things forward.
Absolutely.
But sort of judging on what we've said, it's highly unlikely. Let's bring this to a close. If you've been watching us live, really appreciate it. Michael and I will be on Sky News in the usual studio, in the usual outfit, of course, after 2 o'clock. But thanks for your questions. Keep them coming in. Michael will be back probably with Kamali next week. Thanks for now.